Welcome to tonight's webinar with ADHD Online. We're going to let people join for just a couple of seconds and then we'll get started. We really appreciate all the interest that we've had this year in our webinar series. This is our third one, and we plan to continue doing these every couple of weeks. Tonight, in a timely, given the month of February and yesterday was Valentine's Day, we thought it'd be great to talk about ADHD and relationships. And we were honored to be joined by author Melissa Orlov. Melissa is the founder of ADHDmarriage.com. She is the author of the ADHD Effect on Marriage and also the co-author of The Couple's Guide to Thriving with ADHD. Thanks for joining us, Melissa.
Oh, I'm delighted to be here tonight, actually. Thanks.
Yeah. So we're going to, Melissa's going to walk us through a short version of her topics that she typically covers. And we'll spend the first half of the hour going through that. And then we'll spend the second half of the hour asking Melissa any questions that the audience might have. So if you've got any questions you'd like to submit throughout the webinar, please submit those using the Q&A function down at the bottom of the Zoom, and we will try to answer those in the order they're submitted. So Melissa, I'm going to turn my video off and turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here and welcome to everybody who's coming in right now. As you all know from your own relationships, the topic of ADHD and relationships is a complicated one. So I'm doing the ultra short version here just to give you a taste of some of the bigger issues that couples face. So if you want to go to the next slide. There we go. Thank you. So I call it my in a nutshell kind of a thing. Some points to start out, some sort of overarching points. First of all, adult ADHD impacts most areas of the lives of the people who have it, particularly if it's unmanaged, and or even if you don't know about it. And in fact, about 80% of adults who have ADHD are not yet aware that they have it. They don't have a diagnosis yet. So the folks who do and who are here getting the information are actually really lucky, and you're well on your path. One of the things that happens in relationships is that ADHD and also responses to ADHD really cause very predictable issues and very specific patterns. And it's much more of an impact than people think it is. A lot of the patterns that you're experiencing, and I'm going to talk to you about a couple of them tonight, you'll recognize them because they're very common. And what's going on is it's not just about ADHD and ADHD symptoms, it's also about responses to ADHD and how the two of you incorporate and talk about ADHD in the relationship. So when I work with couples, I work with both members of the couple to bring their best selves to the relationship. But what I call mixed couples, where you have one non-ADHD partner and one ADHD partner, are a lot more different than you think you are. It has to do with how your brain is wired and functions, actually. So you might be at the same event or experiencing the same thing, and yet in reality you see it very differently. It comes into your mind very differently. Your brain captures it very differently. This has to do with low dopamine levels. It has to do with the attention system, the reward system, and the fact that the ADHD brain is often not very filtered. Lots of stuff comes into it, whereas the non-ADHD brain tends to be much more sort of hierarchical and focused on certain things to the point where it misses a lot of other things that are going on around it. So neither brain is better. They just perform differently, and it's a lot more different than you think. So one of the mistakes we make is actually to assume that our partners sees things the same way we do or experiences things the same way we do. But the good news is, and this is what I do for a living, knowledge is power. I try to help introduce people to patterns, to specific tools, and to the power of engagement, bringing your best self forward. So, and emotions run deep in these relationships, both because of the emotionality that is common in adult ADHD, And also because over time, with the repetitive nature of symptoms, particularly unmanaged symptoms, things tend to get worse and worse. They sort of accumulate. All right, next slide, please. So one of the basic parts of these relationships is that the symptoms for ADHD are right at the heart of what is going on in your relationship and what you expected. So, distractibility, for example, is sort of the opposite of somebody who's attentive or romantic, right? If you're distracted, you're sort of not paying attention to any specific thing for very long. The difficulty planning that people with ADHD have flies in the face of your expectations of a true partnership where there's shared responsibility for planning, for paperwork, for kids, whatever. And there are time management issues, difficulty completing tasks, which directly impacts trust. If you expect that your partner is going to be able to reliably follow through, and then ADHD symptoms or perhaps poor support structures get in the way, then you start to think, well, I don't know whether my partner is going to do that, and that impacts trust. There are short-term memory issues, anger and emotional lability or dysregulation, and a strong tendency because of shame issues that come from growing up with ADHD for many adults, not all of them, but many adults with ADHD, a strong tendency to retreat from conflict or to escape. So all of these things are at the heart of what you expected in your relationship, and yet these are symptoms that get in the way of that. And that's one of the reasons, if you're struggling, that's one of the reasons why you may be struggling. Okay, next slide. Thank you. So I talked about patterns, and one of the things that people, you probably recognize this one in your relationship, you may well, is that you get a symptom or a starting place. So in this particular example, it's an ADHD symptom, that is the starting place. And then there is a response to that symptom based in misinterpretation of what the symptom is all about. And then there's a response to the response. And pretty soon the couple is fighting about the responses and has sort of let go of the original symptom. And so things don't get very far. So let me take you through an example of this that has to do with distractibility. Distractibility is the number one symptom of adult ADHD. Even if you have the hyperactive version, you still likely have distractible, not always, but usually have distractible issues as well. So if distraction is a core symptom, the behavior that entails is that you pay attention to whatever is immediate. One of the complaints that you hear in relationships impacted by ADHD is, my partner does not keep track of what's important, right? So important is a hierarchical thing, and if you're just paying attention to whatever is immediate and coming at you in the moment, important isn't really in that equation, right? So you pay attention to what is immediate, and typically, whatever is grabbing your attention, the shiny thing, as people like to say, is the thing that where you're gonna put your focus. So over the time, the partner just becomes one of many things that you can focus on, and the partner starts to feel unattended. So the misinterpretation of the symptom, right? The symptom is distractibility. Doesn't have anything to do with whether or not a partner loves you. It's just that they're distracted. But the misinterpretation is, since my partner doesn't pay special attention to me or doesn't listen to what my priorities are or follow through, my partner doesn't love me. That's the common misinterpretation. Or doesn't care about me. And so the thing that you want is you want that attention. That was one of the great expectations in that hyper-focused courtship, which I won't talk about today, but which is part of ADHD. And so you start to try to get attention. And that might start out with, sexy lingerie or something, but it often turns into pursuit of some sort, some kind of intrusive pursuit, or sometimes yelling, or even moving to a emotional abuse situation, because the distraction is still there. So you ask for attention, and then as soon as you go away, the distractibility is still there and it comes back, right? So the partner's response over time is to start to fight back because they're getting pursued. And their partner is saying, you don't care about me, you don't love me. And the partner's going, what are you talking about? Of course I love you. So they fight back, or they escape, or they avoid, or whatever. And then, of course, because the person wants attention, the fighting back, the escaping, or the avoiding becomes a problem because that's the opposite of what they want. And so it's this negative reinforcing cycle around the responses. And both partners are playing a role here, all because they misinterpret the ADHD symptom. And this is part of why understanding how ADHD impacts your relationship is so powerful. Because if you actually know that it's a symptom, if you know that your partner loves you, but also gets distracted, is easily distracted, then you can have a different approach. You don't pursue the partner and become more aggressive. You might say to your partner, hey, this week you've become particularly distracted. I'm feeling a little bit lonely. Why don't we go out for dinner on Friday night and spend some time together? Right? And you reconnect and you get the attention that you're looking for because there are fewer distractions and it's fun to go out and it's a completely different outcome, right? You're no longer fighting. You've addressed the ADHD, you've acknowledged it. It's neutral. There's no judgment. It's just, oh, you know what? There's some distraction going on and I'm starting to feel a certain way, so I'm going to alert you and let's address it, right? Completely different outcome. Next slide, please. So one of the parts about working with ADHD is managing it optimally when you're an adult. The research is very clear. Most of the research is done on the first two legs here. So this is my model. I've added leg 3 because of what I do and how important it is. But let me briefly take you through this just because it's a very good conceptual way to think about how to optimize your treatment. The misunderstanding, which probably most of you are sophisticated enough to have heard, is that medications are the answer for ADHD, and it's far from that. The research is very clear. Medications are not the answer alone, that you need to do medications and behavioral shifts because you might get better focus with medications. They do have some of the best effect sizes for improving the symptoms, but it's how you apply the focus or the lowered emotional content and stuff to the behaviors with other people or in your life that makes a difference. So the idea here is that the leg 1 treatments are all treatments that change how the brain functions because ADHD is about the brain. So medications is obviously in that, but research also says aerobic exercise, in getting more sleep, getting better sleep hygiene, mindfulness training, meditation training, fish oil to a lesser degree, that's at the bottom of the list for a reason, but that all of those things have been demonstrated to change actually how the brain functions. And so exercise, for example, is really a good mood stabilizer, which is useful. It's also can be used tactically for focus. The focus improves for about 3 hours. So if you have something to do in the afternoon, you can exercise at lunch, for example, and improve your performance in the afternoon. So things like that. Leg 2 is behavioral strategies for the ADHD partner. And there are bazillions of these. Organizers, reminders, people who take on your tasks for you, bank accounts that you set up in certain ways, or bill pay or whatever, reminders, just a whole bunch of things that essentially take the structures that you would love to have in your brain but maybe don't outside your body and help you stay organized and help you stay on task and get you motivated when you need to get motivated in a healthy way, all of that stuff. Then leg 3 is the interactive stuff with people around you, and in my case, what I'm working with is partners. So it's routines, behaviors like the one I just described that helps your relationship work much better, right? So there's such a thing as a verbal cue where you, for example, don't want a conversation to escalate. You set up a specific cue, and then you can insert that cue before the escalation happens so that you don't get out of control. There are meetings and routines. There's some scheduled attend time, and by that, what I mean is, spending time where you're just focused on each other, check-ins, all sorts of stuff. I'm going to give you some examples of some of the ways that work for people with ADHD. But first I want to talk about some of the interactions that are the most important. So I talked about the symptom response cycle, and there are many of those. That was just one example. On the next slide, if you can switch over to that, I want to talk about one of the most important ones, which is, nope, that's backwards. You need to go the other direction. There you go. No, it should say parent-child dynamics. You're going the wrong way. Keep going. There we go. Okay, that's it. Um, so parent-child dynamics is it's a pursuit retreat thing, but I call it parent-child dynamics. It's between an adult who is behaving in a parental capacity and an adult who is behaving in a lesser status or childlike capacity. And it's exceptionally common in these relationships. It is very destructive to the relationship because the status is imbalanced. Somebody is the manager and somebody is not the manager and doesn't have a whole lot of status in the relationship. You are not partners. It impacts everything, including your sex life. It's typically either it's the more organized person. So in this case, I'm calling that person the non-ADHD partner, but they might be a more organized ADHD partner. And a less organized partner. And typically that person has the parent figure has too much responsibility. They're over functioning. They're trying to get the chaos in the household under control. So they're trying to sort of, get everything organized. They become very resentful and angry. They may nag. Reminders all the time. Did you do this? Sort of critiques, education, all of that stuff. You may recognize one of you in that description. At the same time, the childlike partner, the ADHD partner, the under-functioning partner, is not reliable. I used to laugh calling my husband reliably unreliable. I never knew when something was going to actually come and happen or not. There's less responsibility in their hands. Maybe they don't finish, or don't want to even take on tasks. This leads, the dynamics between the couple leads to resentment, often sort of defiant, you're not the boss of me kinds of interactions. Stop bossing me around, stop telling me what I have to do, or sort of requests for help rather than taking responsibility, like just make me a list and I'll go do this. Okay, next slide. It's a very, as I said, very destructive thing. And what happens is that couples fall into very unproductive patterns around this. And broadly speaking, they sort of fall into two camps. The non-ADHD partner has what I call sort of a win the battle, lose the war strategy. Everything feels like it's going to blast apart and it's going to be too chaotic if they don't take control. And so everything is sort of around trying to get the ADHD partner to be more reliable, to get control of the situation, to get more calm in the household. And a lot of these strategies that I have here do over time start to develop, right? It's not immediate. In fact, at the first outset of the relationship, lots of times it's very benign kind of, hey, you know what? I can do this better. Why not? I'll do it. But when you add kids in particular, there's just too much for one person to sort of be juggling all. And some of this is gender related. If you've been reading any of the newspaper articles about cognitive load for women who manage, it's particularly bad when you have the woman as the non-ADHD partner and the man as the ADHD partner. And you get these wins of a battle, like this person who says, I yell at my partner because if I don't really get in his face, he ignores me. And you know what? I've asked him 3 times already and he ignored me. So now I'm going to yell at him. And the rest of that thought is, and he deserves it, right? That's the rest of that unspoken. But the problem is, of course, that there's a huge long-term cost, right? The relationship suffers when the other partner's like, oh, the only time my partner wants to talk to me is when they're yelling at me. I don't want to be around that person. And then that suffers. Okay, next slide, please. Now, the ADHD partner has their own set of sort of standard unproductive responses. And again, these might not fall exactly for you, but these are the pretty common responses. And the ADHD partners tend to barbell. So they either don't confront the problem, or they very aggressively confront the problem and they blow it up. So it's sort of 2 ends of the extreme is where I typically see people with ADHD. So you'll get stonewalling and digging in. You get a lot of aggressive behavior from men in particular, but also from women. A ton of defensiveness, like just high sensitivity, denial that there's any issue, a lot of anger, or retreat, right? That's a confronting the problem. One of the things that I didn't talk about here, but which leads in or makes is part of this, is the sort of two ADHD time zones. As Ned Hallowell likes to say, when you have ADHD, there's now and there's not now. And if it's in the now, you're paying attention to it. And if it's in the not now, either the future or the past, it's nowhere on your radar screen, right? So in this kind of situation where you don't want to confront the problem, if you just put it into the not now, it kind of goes away for you. But the problem, of course, is it doesn't go away for your partner. And so it comes back. And so this is where a lot of the conflict is. If there's just, neither partner is performing in a way that feels equal or fair. And this is really common. I'll be surprised. Most people will recognize this in their relationship. Okay, the next slide, please. So it does not have to be that way. This is what I do, is I help people learn completely different ways to interact that take into account something that most couples don't have in their relationship. And unfortunately, when you go to a therapist who doesn't really understand ADHD, lots of times you'll get well-intentioned but uninformed kinds of support, like, well, you should just try harder to do this thing, or tests that the therapist and one of the partners might set up for, let's say, the ADHD partner. Well, we'll see if you can do this. And of course, that's not how you manage ADHD. How you manage ADHD is a process of using all three legs of treatment towards very specific target symptoms. You pick 2 or 3 of the, say, 8 symptoms that you might have that you really want to focus in on. And then you choose strategies that work against those specific symptoms, right? You don't want to pick 100 million strategies. You want only the strategies that work against the symptoms that you're trying to address. So when I work with couples, one of the things that I do is I help couples figure out, what are the target symptoms in your relationship? What are the things where if you fixed this one element or this set of symptoms, whether it's time management or it's emotional lability or emotional being, very easily triggered, or whether it's organizational stuff or motivation. You figure out what these things are, and then you hone in on those for a while and really address those. That's how you make progress. But part of what you're making while you're doing this is so that you can get this equal status in the relationship. It is important to understand who each person is much more clearly, and also to be able to be perceived as reliable enough to alleviate some of the tension and the anxiety. People who have ADHD don't turn into people who don't have ADHD. That's not what happens. But once you both realize or both start to understand what's going on, things can vastly improve. It's really important to think about equal status. That parent-child dynamic just simply is unhealthy and does not work. You cannot escape it completely, because typically you have somebody who's got stronger executive functions and somebody who doesn't. But couples who figure out how to make it neutral and who minimize it as much as possible can do very well. Engagement, or as John Gottman says, turning towards your partner, is really an important issue. So if you're escaping, if you're putting things into the not now, if you're trying to blow things up so that you don't have to talk about something, all of those things are the opposite of engagement. You will certainly have different opinions and approaches, not only from family history and perhaps gender, and certainly from how your brains work. But it's not just because of ADHD. ADHD plays a big role, for sure, but it isn't just about that. So turning towards, getting the courage to turn towards. If you've been in a relationship where you've been defensive, or somebody's been aggressive, or you've both been angry at each other, or sort of easily triggered, it takes courage to say, you know what, we're going to do it differently. We're going to learn what we need to do, and we're going to start turning towards each other and solving these things. But I see it happen all the time. You can definitely do it. Emotional Emotional regulation is also really, really important for these relationships. The research starting in about, I don't know, 2014, maybe a little bit before that, there was started to be a lot of conversation about emotional dysregulation as a core characteristic of ADHD. Now, a lot of people are talking about rejection sensitive dysphoria as sort of the extreme version of that. And it's a really important component. As you can imagine, if you are with someone who will get easily triggered over anything, like, gee, we need more cheese. I was talking to somebody today who was giving this example. Gee, we need more cheese, and thinking that that's a critique, that person didn't actually go and buy more cheese already or something. It's really hard to traverse your daily life. So it leads to chronic anger, resentment, hopelessness, all of these things that the emotional dysregulation impacts. And both partners get lit up, by the way. It might be the ADHD partner who has this core characteristic of emotional dysregulation, but I'll tell you, non-ADD partners can get really angry. So, what I try to help people understand is that you can bring your best self to the relationship, and you should. And if you do, there are many things that can really help. So, I'm going to do two more slides here, and then I'll take questions. The next slide, I'm going to be just giving you some examples of different ways that people interact around having ADHD in their relationship. The first one is a man who came to me. He was a non-ADHD partner. His wife had ADHD, and he wanted me to tell his wife that she needed to put away her clothes because that's what he says. That's what normal people do, which of course it just makes you want to kill yourself when you hear this. But in any event, I disappointed him because my response to that was, oh, she leaves her clean clothes in the dryer. That sounds like a great system. She can find it. She knows, she knows where her clean clothes are. She doesn't have to search around for them. She doesn't have to spend time trying to figure out what drawers to put everything in. And as long as there's some kind of laundry basket there or something, so that if you need to use the dryer, you can just put her stuff in the laundry basket. Sounds like a great system. And she gets to work on time. He did not like that answer. But that's a good example of integrating ADHD. I mean, she didn't want to do the drawers and all the sorting and figuring out where stuff went every time. To her, it was a waste of time. And she got done what she needed to get done. Similarly, a woman who shared with me that she hated cleaning the kitchen. She had real trouble motivating to do it, and it seemed a little bit overwhelming. So she gamified it by setting a 10-minute kitchen timer, one of those little dial things, and she would race the timer to see how quickly she could clean up the kitchen. Right? Again, another way. That's one of those behavioral strategies, those leg 2 behavioral strategies that allow you to work on those symptoms. Sometimes people who have trouble getting out of bed in the morning because they're kind of night owls, you might put multiple alarms, including some across the room. You've got clocks that spin around that you have to actually catch, all sorts of stuff. On the interactive side of things, I talked a little bit about verbal cues, but I'll give you one example of an effective verbal cue is one that's sort of a notification cue. So it's pretty easy to feel overwhelmed when you have this very busy ADHD brain, and a verbal cue can help you notify your partner. And the verbal cue might be, gee, I'm starting to feel overwhelmed. And the response to that cue, which is part of setting up a verbal cue, which I didn't have time to talk about today, but the response to it is orchestrated. It's agreed to ahead of time, not while you're using the cue. And the response to that cue would be to say, oh, okay, and just maybe to stop talking and allow the person to start to be less overwhelmed, and then go back into the conversation. Rather than one other option would be, let's say, continuing to talk because you are anxious and you want to keep talking, and the overwhelm then sort of shuts down that partner. I teach something about called a learning conversation, which is not my model, somebody else's, but it is a way of respecting what each partner is saying and giving legitimacy to each partner. I recommend regular task coordination, and notice the word coordination. It isn't about saying, okay, here are your tasks. You take them away, you go do them and do them on my time frame. That would be delegation. And that's an imbalance of power. It's having the two of you sit together and figure out, what are the priorities for this week? Who's going to do them? When are you going to do them? Etc. And the meeting becomes the way to see whether or not each partner is doing the tasks that they want to do. So it takes the burden off of the non-ADHD partner or the more organized partner to oversee things. So that's one strategy for tasks. There are many more. I had a couple who had a lot of internal, the ADHD partner in particular had a lot of internal anxiety. So another one of these leg three strategies, which is an interactive strategy, is that the couple created a nighttime routine where they would finish this sentence. The most important thing you need to know about me today is, and they would listen to each other. And it was transformative for their relationship because one of their big issues was this man's anxiety. And the anxiety would build up inside him. And then he would do all sorts of crazy decisions based upon how anxious he was feeling. And his partner didn't know about the anxiety, but she could see the decisions he was making, and it was very confusing to her. So as soon as he was able to do this, he could say on the first day he was starting to feel it, oh, I'm feeling really anxious about X. And she would receive it well, right? Another strategy, this one for connecting, is to schedule a certain amount of time in the afternoon. My husband and I used to do this. Saturday afternoons, we would drop our son off at a rehearsal and we would spend 3 hours doing something in Boston. And we met in the middle on one of these sort of, equality things. We scheduled the time, which was for me, because I'm the non-ADHD partner. And then we went on to an iPad when we got downtown and picked something that was going on that day. That was the spontaneity of it. And it was really fun. And it was over attention to connecting with each other and not just doing tasks and etc. So, okay, so my final slide is for some resources. As I said, this is the sort of very top line thing. I just want to give you a sense, if we could change the slide, I want to give you a sense of some of the different kinds of approaches, how rich it can be, and that there is a lot of information out there that can help you. I hope that you have seen yourselves in this. My website that I founded quite a long time ago now is adhdmarriage.com. You don't have to be married to go to it. There's a ton of information. I have a blog there that you can read. I also blog for psychologytoday.com. And then I also have other resources that I've put together over the years, including a couples seminar, which is 8 weeks. It's given by Zoom. What you're seeing here tonight is similar to what you would see in that course in terms of format, a presentation and then a live Q&A. I have a self-study version of that as well. My books are there. There's the pictures of the books. I give support groups for non-ADHD partners, and also a couple of other classes that some coaches actually do for me in areas that I think couples benefit from. If you're interested in any of these, I urge you to go take a look relatively quickly. I have one more round of things happening this spring, and they have, the registrations are open right now for the seminar, and will open up soon for the support groups, which fill up quite quickly. So, and with that, I will start to take questions, and I appreciate your attention.
Great. Well, Melissa, this is fantastic. I think any couple could learn something from this, and I'm very excited now to kind of dive into the Q&A. And I'm going to start with one. We've probably got about 8 people that have asked either anonymously or by name about advice for mixed couples. So couples both having ADHD.
Okay,
And
so
some of the
non-mixed
dynamics.
couples in
Well,
my
yeah, non-mixed couples. Yeah, I guess
yeah.
they were actually calling it mixed couples, but yeah, it,
I like that.
but yeah, and some people have the same diagnosis, some people have different diagnosis.
Yeah.
So
Well, so there's pros and there are a couple different ways to slice and dice it actually. So you usually will have one person who is more organized or more invested in being organized than the other one. So some of what I talk about for non-ADHD partners holds true for those partners. But dual ADHD couples sort of flip back and forth in terms of what their role is depending upon the situation. And so what I suggest, this is true across the board, but it's much more true for dual ADHD couples, is that they pick and choose the information based upon what fits their specific situation and ignore the rest and ignore the labels. And what I see with ADHD couples, they don't have the backstop of having somebody who has really high executive function skills usually. They don't usually have somebody who's a natural manager like I am, and that's in some ways good because you're less likely to manage your partner. But that does mean that delegation, if you can do it, is useful. If you can get somebody else to do some of this stuff or simplify your life a little bit, that's very helpful. And the other one of the other things is that the job retention for people with ADHD can be lower. And so you have to be careful to be circumspect in terms of the amount of debt you take on or how big a house you get or some of that kind of stuff, just to protect yourself so that you don't end up in a really dire situation financially. And other than that, I think there are some benefits, which is they each understand how hard it is and what it's like to have ADHD, even if they have um, uh, different types of ADHD. And so that can be a real benefit. I mean, I have one couple that I'm very close to, some family members who both have ADHD, and I watch with great interest. Their life is kind of low key, and they just sort of do things as they come up and move through them, and they're both really happy with that. So there can be a really good match there.
Great. All right. Well, we had a question that came in prior to the webinar on advice for dividing chores in ADHD couples.
Yeah. So there are a lot of different ways to attack this issue. I talked about having a regular coordination meeting, which I think is really important just because that helps the communication. As long as that meeting is neutral and you don't have one person dictating to the other, but that both people, even though it's not much fun to have these meetings, and I recognize that. And some couples will, they have the sort of daily catch up, like while they're walking their dogs or something like that. But some kind of coordination meeting. I also encourage couples to take a look at who's doing what already and figure out whether or not that fits each person's strengths. Because and whether it's adequately balanced in terms of who's doing what. Sometimes it's hard for non-ADHD partners to actually let go of the chores because they're worried they won't get done the right way or they won't get done at all or whatever. So there is a transition. You don't just abdicate and say, okay, now you're doing these and I'm doing these. The ADHD partner has to have the management in place of the symptoms to be able to perform in a way that he or she is happy with and that their partner is happy with, and that takes work, right? That's why people work with ADHD coaches or whatever to try to strengthen those things. Another one of my sort of favorite strategies, since people get sort of all enmeshed in terms of have you done this yet, have you not, how are you doing it the right way, they get way messed up in each other's boundaries around chores, is to actually put chores into silos where you have complete total control over a certain thing, like maybe
Mhm.
all the technology in the house or all of the grocery and cooking or whatever, so that there's a sort of a soup to nuts for one, and that can work as well, again, as long as you're working with the strengths of each
Right.
partner. So lots of different strategies, and some of them are like, racing the timer and gamifying things and getting yourself motivated and all of that.
Great. That's perfect. So we had an anonymous question come in. Can you touch on shame and guilt and how that impacts self-sabotage to end a relationship due to not being able to face rejection and work through resolutions?
Okay, lots of stuff in that one.
Yeah.
Just okay, so 5 hours later. No,
Right.
seriously, shame is a huge, huge issue in these relationships, um, and it's one of the things that pulls mixed non-ADHD and ADHD couples apart, because the non-ADHD partner doesn't often feel that shame. They don't feel shame over the incompletion of things, or being asked to do something, or fearing failure, or the kinds of things that people with ADHD run into. And so they have trouble comprehending it. To
Hmm.
the non-ADHD partner, it feels like, well, you ought to be, of course you can do that. That's so easy. And that's not recognizing how the ADHD partner has typically grown up, how hard it is to have those symptoms, et cetera. So it's one of the areas that is benefits a lot from really starting to learn to understand it, which you can do through therapy, you can do it through seminars or other things, but to really engage with it. And it's really a difficult emotion to engage with. So when I see defensiveness or very quick trigger anger or whatever, almost always right underneath that is shame. The desire not to engage with feelings of shame is exceptionally strong. So it has to be addressed
Hmm.
in a relationship where it's impacting things, to be able to emotionally balance out the relationship and make that partner more comfortable. One of the best ways to do that is through what's called cognitive behavioral therapy, where you start to address the stories that you tell yourself and replace them with more positive and more accurate stories. Another good therapeutic methodology I have found to deal with shame is actually internal family systems therapy, which is sometimes called parts therapy, where you take a look at your family background or your history in parts. This part of me feels the shame. This part of me feels something else, and then you investigate those little parts and befriend them. Essentially, is sort of the idea. Become comfortable with them. So those are two ways to start to work on that. But try not to trigger shame. If your partner feels a lot of shame, it's hard to bring it out in the open, but it definitely helps.
All right. All right. I've got another anonymous question. Um, can a couple both having ADHD take on the parent-child roles at times? Or I know you touched on this a little bit, or do you think the question was, or are they less likely because there's more understanding amongst each other?
Well, that would be dependent upon the individuals. I think there is a gender dynamic to the parent-child thing as well. I think I see women, if you have a both dual ADHD relationship, lots of times if you have a heterosexual couple, the woman will be more likely to be in that parenting type role. Sometimes because some of those responsibilities are house oriented, and for better or for worse, our society still associates women with having to be responsible for many of the household tasks. And those tasks are truly boring for the most part. And that's not an ADHD strength. Um, but I think you do go back and forth. One person will be really interested in something and sort of in charge of that, and more, trying to get the other partner who has ADHD to sort of move along and do it. And then for something else, it'll switch. And dual ADHD couples report that to me.
Okay. Um, what about so we had another anonymous question. Is there a correlation between ADHD, people with ADHD attracting narcissistic partners?
This is the $1 million question. Um, so, so there's some issues around self-observation power for people who have ADHD. And I want to make sure I heard the question correctly. Is it that the ADHD, you think the ADHD partners have
The
narcissism?
ADHD person attracting a
Ah,
narcissistic
okay.
partner.
Yeah, okay. So I actually hear the reverse more, which is, gee, does my partner with ADHD have narcissism? And what I usually tell people is quite possibly not, even if you're tempted to label them that way. I haven't seen any research that would suggest that there's an attraction of narcissistic partners. I do think that whether the person who doesn't have ADHD started out that way, many of them become somewhat anxious and that might lead to some sort of focus on themselves. But I haven't seen any research that would say that that's something that commonly happens, nor have I seen a lot of it in my practice.
Okay. Let's see, we've got another anonymous question. How does one function in a new relationship with someone who's understanding of ADHD when your past partner was very much nitpicky and the parent figure?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Well, it sounds like that. So they're in a new relationship, someone that's more understanding of
Ah,
ADHD,
okay. All right.
but it's new to them. And
Yeah.
we hear that a lot. There's kind of this like, how do I talk about ADHD? When do I bring it up? Like,
So but not everybody would agree with this. I'm a firm believer that it should be a topic that when it's relevant, it's brought up in a completely neutral way and accepted in a neutral way. I do not think that ADHD is something to be ashamed of. It is
mhm,
just simply a different way of being in the world. And
right.
it doesn't always fit. Sometimes it's perfect for the situation. Emergency room doctors who really need to get an adrenaline rush and stay on task. I talked with people in special ops who say, we actually, without saying this, we actually sort of sort through for people who have ADHD because they do really well in our programs. I mean, there are things
Yeah.
that are really where it's really beneficial, but a lot of stuff around the partnership, particularly household responsibility, is not so beneficial. Um, so I think it has to be an open conversation. Where you run into problems is when people start to perceive that it is being used as an excuse. I can't do that because I have ADHD, or I've never been able to do that. When you're engaged with each other and listening to each other and trying to address things for each other, that's a strong relationship. Also, when you have good boundaries about what's yours and what's not yours, that's a strong relationship. So I think the best thing to do is to sort of get out ahead of it. Make sure you understand what is going on in these relationships so that you don't fall into these patterns like the distractibility pattern that I talked about. Um, and then make sure that ADHD is neutral, and try not to be defensive about it at all, as best you can.
That's great advice. All right, so we've got another anonymous question. This one's from someone who's a partner of someone with ADHD.
Mm-hmm.
I said, my partner is diagnosed with ADHD combined type. She's especially distressed by her impulse spending, which has resulted in substantial household clutter and debt. I'm careful to be supportive, not judgmental, because I can see it causes her pain. We've created a budget together, and she seems more confident with specific goals, but she's still struggling with letting go of the items she's already purchased. How can I motivate, assist her in this task?
So that's a really interesting question. I actually see this all the time, and it's not hoarding. That's different. It is the complexity, I think, the complexity of deciding what to do with every individual thing. And I call it the world of unlimited possibilities. Should I should I toss this out, or might I be able to use it at some point? And then this imagination gets going and the creativity gets going, and it is really hard to let go of stuff. Also, it's one of these tasks that's sort of thankless and not very much fun. So it's a bad combination. I think, I've seen people attack this a couple of different ways. I had one couple where they argued for years over getting the basement cleaned out. And finally, I just said, "You guys are driving me crazy. I'm going to step in here. I want you to hire somebody to help the ADHD partner go through the basement and go through and help toss it out." And they fixed it in an afternoon. So it was the argument that was getting in the way, actually not the ability to make the decisions. So that's one approach, is to delegate the hardest part, which is actually dragging it out, and having somebody say, what, you really won't be able to use this. How about if I put this in the
Right.
garbage pile? That's one approach. Another approach is to segment the mess, so that you have silos for mess. So, a garage, a basement, an office, a bedroom closet, where the ADHD partner can be as messy as they want to, have as much stuff as they want to, as long as they can get into the room and open the door. And it's not the other partner's business. That's another way to handle it. Another is this person sounds like they feel kind of guilty about it. is to gently offer assistance if they want it. But you have to be very careful not to overstep the boundaries there.
Mhm. Okay. Here's another anonymous question. How does a couple overcome addiction with the ADHD partner, including unfaithfulness?
Yeah, so the rate of unfaithfulness for people, men and women both, who have ADHD is higher in relationships. So Ari Tuckman did some research on non-ADHD partners and ADHD partners. All of them were in these relationships. And the rate for infidelity, both emotional and physical, was higher for the ADHD partners. So there's definitely something going on there. The addictions have, that dopamine is the one of the primary low levels of dopamine is one of the primary issues for ADHD, and that's part of the reward system as well. So addictions are quite common, and including the infidelity, which is all about the new and the shiny, and a lot of stimulation, a lot of ego gratification, typically for the people who are in it. That stuff has to be brought out into the open, and worked through essentially with a professional counselor. I think couples who try to do it on their own may be successful temporarily, but I think often don't get to the root issues, because there are such complex hurts and pains around it. So it's very good to have a counselor work with you on that to try to help you strengthen that relationship if you decide you're going to stay in it. And many do. But the addiction stuff, depending upon what the addiction is, the AA program is actually quite good for people with ADHD. It does a lot of the things that also help the ADHD, as well as provide a support network. And working with a therapist who's tuned into addictions typically will have some familiarity also with ADHD, since they are pretty tightly combined. Hard to do it on your own. But transparency is critically important. The damage from the affairs, I mean, yeah, you don't really want your partner sleeping with somebody, but the real damage from the affairs actually comes from after the affair has been exposed and then it goes back underground, which is really common. It's the lying that is the damage, often more than the infidelity itself. And so that's why the transparency is better to say, you know what, I don't want to stop this affair right now. And then the partner knows that they have a choice. Do you stay in the same household? Do you not? Do you stay in the same bedrooms? Do you not? Do you have sex together? Is it too dangerous? Is it not? Does the person move out? Then you can make some choices. But if you don't know about it, you are constantly wondering whether or not something is going on. And that is very unhealthy, because that also adds to that sort of oversight thing.
All right. Thank you. Let's see. We had another anonymous question. How do you manage hyperreactivity / triggerability / rejection sensitivity?
So there are a number of different ways to do that. One is that rejection sensitive dysphoria, actually, it's right now it's being verified in research that it's a real thing, but there are actually different medications for the emotional dysregulation part of the ADHD than there is for focus and other things. Intuitive is one, and there are some others. So one of the best ways to manage it is medicinally, because it is definitely physiological. And it has a big component of it. There are other things as well. And even, for example, Wellbutrin, which is, I think it's an SNRI. It's not exactly an antidepressant, but it's very closely related. Also is often used very effectively. So I'm not a doctor, so I have to give that caveat. I'm not telling you to take these things. I'm just giving you some examples of the fact that there are specific medications that are specific to emotional dysregulation and fast triggers. Mindfulness training is also useful if you can feel in your body when you're about to erupt. And I know that the space can be very short between input and output. And that's actually why the medications help increase your ability to think about what you're doing, and as well as calm you. But mindfulness training, you can start to gain more control over how you respond, because you are faster to notice the signals in your body. So that's another thing. If you have a lot of emotional, and then there are things like verbal cues that can help. You can insert before escalation or right at the trigger point. There's coming to terms with defensiveness. Again, some cues to trigger that. Once you're flooded, though, it's almost impossible to do anything. So the way to address these things is to insert something, medication, verbal cue, something, before the person is escalated and flooded. Because at that point, physiologically, the blood flow that normally is in the front logical thinking part of your brain goes back to the fight, flight, amygdala, really basic primitive parts of your brain, and you actually don't think logically. so so at that
That
point,
explains it.
you
Yeah,
can't get into it. So you got to put something in ahead of time before that escalation happens.
I think that's just a great life advice tip in general.
Yeah, indeed.
Um, so we got another question. This one's from Manny. So, how can I do a better job as an ADHD husband and father of three to create my own space to be me? The demands from everyone can be very draining, and I often feel overwhelmed and burned out.
Yeah, so that's a great topic. I bet your wife does, or partner. I shouldn't say wife because I'm making an assumption there that I shouldn't make. But uh, yeah, it's so there's a phase of life when your kids are young where it's just rough to be a parent, and lots of people feel really burned out. And the amount of effort it takes to manage the ADHD can add to that. If you need that space, it is in this case, it's a work-life balance. In this case, the work is the work plus the family and all the demands that everybody's asking. You have to learn how to say no. And I mean both of you, you and your partner, both need to learn how to say no. That might be to some of the programs that the kids are in, where you change around and have sort of calm times or something. It might be to extra projects. One of the things that I didn't have ADHD, but I was overwhelmed in that stage of life. Is I cut back 1 day a week of work, which I, because of my job, was able to do, luckily. And that was tremendously helpful because then we got some good, positive family time on the weekends rather than just constantly doing chores. Another thing is, I think that equally, both partners should be able to take whatever kind of break they need. That might be a weekly exercise class where their partner is in charge. It might be a vacation together for a week where the grandparents are in charge. It might, whatever it is, you deserve to take care of yourselves. And if you take care of yourselves, you will be better parents. So don't assume that you have to respond to everything. You don't. There is a way together, the two of you, to figure out what's critically important, like eating, paying your bills, that stuff. You have to do that stuff. And then there's stuff that's not so important that you can drop off. You don't have to do everything. And giving yourself permission and compassion around that is really useful.
I think that's great advice. Well, let's see. We've got time. We'll do maybe just a couple more questions. Um, this one's anonymous. So, any suggestions for figuring out how to handle what's coming, new task or time demands, while a dual ADHD couple is planning to have kids or expecting? So, the ADHD family prepping for the future.
Yeah. The first thing I would say is go to my website and download the free treatment ebook on the homepage, and make sure. And that gives a lot more about those three legs of treatment. Is why I'm saying that, because you want to get your ADHD managed as well as you can. And I understand if you are expecting that the woman may not be able to take medications and things like that during pregnancy. Probably not, um, but you want to have the structures in place that allow you to engage with things that are chaotic and also important and boring. Because there's a lot of that in the first part of the baby stuff, is just like, this is so much. And the other thing is, maybe write yourself some notes or something about how much you love each other, because for the first weeks or months when you aren't getting sleep, the ADHD symptoms are going to get a lot worse. Sleep deprivation makes ADHD symptoms much more severe, and the kind of sleep deprivation that you get when you have a newborn is like unlike any other.
It is.
So write yourself some notes, remind yourselves how much you love each other, and get some stuff out there so that you can just go back to it, go, yeah, we'll get through this. We'll get through this. And remind, here are some wonderful words I wrote about my partner or whatever. You can reinforce it. And get help if you can. Get somebody that gets is around the baby, family, friends, whatever. Don't be afraid to ask for assistance. It particularly again in the first weeks. But any kinds of systems that you can set up, like bill pay systems, or just basic getting the furniture in ahead of time, those kinds of things are all useful.
All right. Well, that's perfect. I want to end on a couple of things because I think this last question will be a nice send off to the hour. We had a number of people ask if we can share the slides that you gave tonight with the audience afterwards.
Yes, so the answer to that is yes, but I do appreciate it if you don't post them on the web,
Sure.
because people pick up my stuff all the time. These people that go scrape content and then go sell it to somebody else.
Yep.
Makes me a crazy person.
I
But
totally
I'm
agree.
happy to have people have the slides for their personal use, or to share with a partner or whatever. That's fine. And as I said, at my website, there's a lot more information. I got videos, access to the books, the blog. So, and I also make myself available from the standpoint of you can send me an email. I don't promise to answer it immediately, but I typically answer the emails as they come in some way that's helpful. So, I
Great.
try to make myself available.
Great. Well, yeah, and your website, ADHDmarriage.com, has lots of information. It's a fantastic resource. We will be posting the recording of the webinar on our website, and then totally respect your that Melissa about sharing. So we'll email it to people that signed up and make sure to ask them to just keep it for themselves and appreciate them coming. So the last question I thought would be good. Jeff asked, can you elaborate on the format of your couples seminar? We just registered, and is it a group seminar with interactive sessions?
Okay, so it's Zoom, and quite a few couples take it at once. So the format is just like tonight, only longer. So the presentation is 1 hour, and then the Q&A is 45 minutes. So a little extension on both of these things. As you got tonight, you get a lot of information. That's also true. That's just what I do.
Mhm.
And there's also incremental reading, and there are worksheets and stuff. Those things are optional. Not everybody's ready for them. But I have them because some people are. So, I give an entire session on the treatment stuff and get into that in much more detail. And then I talk about patterns, and I talk about communication strategies, specific ways to communicate with each other, teach you how to do verbal cues, talk about lying and cover ups and chores and all the stuff that it's 8 weeks long. And it's pretty intense because it's about an hour and 3/4 every evening that I give it. But very, very useful information. So I hope that some people who are interested will consider it.
Yeah, that's great. Well, Melissa, thank you again. From all of us here at ADHD Online, we really appreciate you taking the time with our audience tonight, answering their questions. We appreciate everyone that attended tonight. Thank you for asking questions and listening in. And we look forward to doing this again soon.
Well, thank you. And I'm so delighted to share this because can be really life changing. So thanks everybody for coming.
Yep. Thanks. All right. Have a great night.